A ruthless billionaire built an empire so vast, yet one forgotten love, and a child he never knew, shattered everything he thought he was. When fate dragged him back to the woman he abandoned, he faced a truth money could never buy, a second chance. But would it come too late? Before we dive into today's emotional story, welcome to Emotions and Beyond. If you love heartfelt tales full of love, kindness, and second chances, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story. And I'd love to know, where are you watching me from? Drop it in the comments below. The boardroom was a cathedral of power, every surface gleaming with wealth, every shadow whispering authority, and at its center sat Alexander Croft, the man who had clawed his way up from nothing to build an empire that bent cities to his will, his gaze as sharp as the skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. His executives sat stiff in their seats, laptops glowing with projections worth billions, and yet none of them breathed unless he allowed it. He thrived on silence, on control, on the crisp rhythm of his voice dictating futures. The only sound was the deliberate tick of an antique clock he'd acquired at an auction, a reminder that time was money and money was life, and Alexander owned both. Then it happened, the vibration, a soft hum across the polished wood of the mahogany table. Heads turned, confused. Nobody dared interrupt these meetings, nobody dared touch that phone. Alexander's personal line was sacred, shielded, encrypted, reserved for less than 5 people in the entire world. His gaze flickered down at the glowing screen. An unknown number. Impossible. His system was designed to reject, to erase, to eliminate the unwanted. His instinct was immediate. Swipe it away, destroy the intrusion, return to the empire before him. But his hand hesitated. Just a breath. Just enough for unease to slither under his skin. Against logic, against training, against everything he had built to keep the world at bay, he pressed accept. Silence, except for the faint static of the connection. Then, breathing. Shallow, uneven, fragile. His frown deepened, ready to hang up. And then a voice, so small, so terrified, so utterly unlike anything he had ever heard in the cold confines of his glass kingdom. Please, is anyone there? It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a threat. It was a cry. My mom, she won't wake up. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. The words crack. Ed fell apart mid-sentence, rebuilt themselves with courage far too heavy for the little chest that carried them. Alexander froze. Every instinct screamed, end this. It's nothing, it's a mistake, but the sound lodged inside him like a shard of glass, cutting through armor he hadn't realized was brittle. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table. Who is this? His voice, iron and ice, filled the silence. There was a pause. He could almost hear her clutching the phone tighter, her breath stuttering through tears. My name's Lily, she whispered. His grip on the device tightened, jaw locked. Lily, he repeated, like the name itself was an intrusion. How did you get this number? She swallowed, the tiny click audible across the line. I found it. In Mommy's drawer. It was written on the back of a picture. It said. Her voice cracked, courage flickering. It said, only in ultimate emergency. Alexander's blood turned to ice. Only in ultimate emergency. He had written those words once, long ago, for one person. But that was impossible. That life was buried. That chapter was closed. The edges of the photo she mentioned burned in his memory, a ghost he had sworn he'd never see again. His knuckles went white around the phone, the muscles in his hand rigid, the breath leaving him unevenly. Executives shifted nervously, watching the man who never faltered suddenly still, as if struck. He forced words through clenched teeth. Who is your mother? His voice cracked like a whip, desperate, demanding, terrified of the answer. On the other end, the girl hiccuped through tears, struggling to speak, and just as the syllables began to form, just as the truth was about to breach the walls he had built around his heart, the line shuddered, crackled, and cut out. Dead. Silence swallowed him. The boardroom waited, a dozen eyes locked on their emperor unraveling in real time. Alexander Croft, the man who never flinched, stared at the dead phone in his hand as though it had transformed into a loaded gun. For a heartbeat, he didn't breathe. Then the chair scraped back, sharp and violent against the floor. Executives jumped. He rose, movements fast, controlled, purposeful, but underpinned by something they had never seen before: panic. He didn't speak. He didn't excuse himself. He simply moved, grabbing the keys from the table with a force that rattled the glass. His assistant scrambled up, stammering, "Sir, the merger!" But the look in his eyes silenced her words, the kind of look that could dismantle kingdoms. He strode toward the door, every step echoing like thunder. Security tried to follow, confused, their earpieces buzzing with questions. Staff whispered, eyes wide, as the billionaire who never left mid-deal abandoned billions with a clenched jaw and a storm in his gaze. The boardroom remained frozen, a monument to power suddenly emptied of its god. For the first time in years, Alexander Croft's empire didn't matter. For the first time in years, a stranger's voice had pierced his armor. And as he pushed through the revolving doors of his glass tower, the question thundered louder than the city beyond. Why did this child have his number? The doors of the tower slammed behind him, city air hitting his face like a storm, as Alexander strode across the pavement, each step heavy with an urgency no one had ever seen in the billionaire who usually moved with precision and pride, his driver hurrying to open the sleek black car. But Alexander snatched the keys himself, sliding behind the wheel with a ferocity that startled even his security detail, the engine roaring to life like a beast awakened, tires screeching as he tore out into traffic. Glass towers reflecting a man unrecognizable even to himself. The city blurred around him in streaks of steel and neon, but inside his chest a far older, heavier picture fought to the surface, a name he had buried in shadows clawing its way back to the forefront of his mind. Belle Vance. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles bone white, his jaw rigid as memories surged, uninvited, unstoppable. He remembered the way she used to sketch designs on napkins when they stayed late in his office, lines flowing like water, ideas alive with brilliance. Her laughter echoing against walls he had thought were only built for business, and how, in moments he never admitted, her presence had softened him, threatened him, made him feel human. That was why he had cut her out, too talented, too radiant, too dangerous for the man who believed love was weakness. He had signed her termination papers without blinking, told himself it was discipline, control, necessity. He had convinced himself he had chosen empire over distraction, and for years it worked. Until a little girl's voice cracked the armor, and the ghost of Belle's name wrapped itself around his throat like chains. He swerved through lanes, horns blaring, drivers shouting, but none of it mattered, none of it reached him. He was already somewhere else. In the past he had locked away, in the memories he had starved, in the eyes of a child who sounded too much like the woman he had cast aside. A red light bled into the windshield, but he didn't stop, racing through as sirens wailed distantly, their sound twisting into the question burning in his mind. Had he already failed them? He could almost see her face in the glass reflection of the skyscrapers he sped past. Belle standing in front of him, proud and defiant, her voice sharp as she told him once that he was too afraid to be human, too afraid to feel. He had laughed then, mocked her idealism, crushed it with his logic. But now those words returned like knives, slicing through his chest with every turn of the wheel. The cityscape shifted as he left behind the polished streets of power, the roads narrowing, the lights dimming, skyscrapers giving way to crumbling brick and rusted fire escapes, and with every block the grip of memory tightened. He had promised himself he would never return here, not after clawing his way out, not after swearing this part of the city would never touch him again. Yet here he was, barreling into the forgotten edges of a life he had erased, guided not by reason but by a child's broken plea. The car rattled against uneven pavement, graffiti-covered walls flashing by, the smell of damp and smoke seeping through his half-open window, and still he pushed the accelerator harder, heart pounding, breath sharp. He tried to imagine Lily's face, but instead Belle's eyes stared back at him, accusing, pleading, alive in his mind, though he had long pretended she was gone. His phone lay silent on the seat beside him, the deadline mocking him with the weight of everything unsaid. He pressed his foot down, weaving through traffic, the growl of the engine carrying him deeper into the night. The echoes of police sirens rose again somewhere behind, reminders of danger in the city's veins, but Alexander was chasing a different siren, the one screaming inside him, warning that he was already too late. His chest constricted as he passed the faded sign of the neighborhood he had promised himself never to see again. The very streets where hunger had once taught him cruelty, where failure had been his first inheritance, and where Belle had once smiled at him like he was worth more than all of it. The steering wheel trembled under his grip as the roads narrowed further, leading him toward a place he had erased from every map of his empire. And with every block closer, the question roared louder than the engine. Was he racing toward redemption, or arriving at regret too late to change anything? The car screeched to a halt at the curb, gravel spitting under the tires as Alexander leapt out, heart hammering with a ferocity he hadn't felt since his earliest days of survival, his eyes locking on the dilapidated building before him, its bricks cracked, windows jagged, and door hanging from rusted hinges like the shell of a place long forgotten. And the moment he crossed the threshold, the stench hit him, thick, suffocating, unmistakable, the heavy tang of leaking gas, cloying in the back of his throat, crawling into his lungs, making every instinct scream to run, but he pushed deeper into the dark corridor, his polished shoes splashing through puddles on the warped floorboards, fluorescent lights overhead flickering as though even they were too weak to survive here. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning the echo of his footsteps, and then he saw her, small, fragile, trembling in the shadows of the hallway, clutching a worn teddy bear so tight its seams threatened to burst, her face streaked with tears, blue eyes wide and shimmering as though they held the weight of both terror and desperate hope, and the sight cleaved through him sharper than any blade. "Help her," Lily whispered, her voice cracking as she pointed toward the kitchen. He followed her shaking finger, and what he saw ripped the breath from his lungs. Belle lay sprawled on the cracked linoleum floor, her skin pale as porcelain, chest unmoving, one arm limp beside a pot that had boiled over, flames licking faintly at the stove beneath it, gas hissing like a snake ready to strike. For a heartbeat, the empire builder in him collapsed, and all that remained was a man staring at the woman he had once destroyed, the woman he had never truly forgotten. He didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion he tore off his suit jacket, swung it at the stove to smother the flame, twisted the knobs until the hiss silenced, then turned and slammed the nearest window open, shards of glass raining down as fresh air surged into the poisoned room. His lungs burned, his eyes stung, but he dropped to his knees beside her, the grime of the floor staining fabric worth thousands, yet meaning nothing compared to the faint life slipping through his fingers. "Belle," he muttered. "Red," his voice shaking in a way no one had ever heard, not even himself. His hand hovered, trembling, terrified of what he might not feel. Behind him, Lily's small voice cracked again, desperate and brittle. Is she dying?" The question pierced him deeper than any boardroom betrayal, and for the first time since he could remember, Alexander Croft's hands shook uncontrollably as he pressed two fingers against Belle's throat, searching, begging, praying for the flicker of a pulse, for proof that he wasn't too late, that fate hadn't punished him beyond redemption, his own heartbeat a drum of fear as the silence of the apartment weighed heavier than the entire empire he had built. "She's alive, but barely." Alexander's voice tore through the thin air of the apartment as he barked into his phone for paramedics, every word trembling with urgency as though sheer force could will time to move faster, his usually commanding tone fraying at the edges, betraying the terror that sat like ice in his veins, and while he pressed down gently on Belle's wrist to reassure himself that her pulse was still there, weak, fluttering, but alive, his eyes kept darting to the little girl kneeling only inches away, clutching her threadbare teddy bear so tightly it seemed her only anchor to a collapsing world. He turned toward her, and in a rare softness foreign to his iron frame, he bent close and whispered, his breath ragged, "Your mom is strong. She'll fight, I promise." The words feeling strange in his mouth because he had never promised comfort to anyone before, yet they spilled out instinctively, as though something deep inside of him recognized this fragile child before logic could catch up. Lily blinked at him with wide, shimmering eyes too piercing, too familiar, as though they cut through the armor he'd spent years constructing around himself, and she studied him with a steadiness far beyond her small years. Whispering in a voice quivering but certain, she said, "You built big things." But she didn't want to bother you, and the sound of it struck Alexander like a blow to the chest, because no one knew how fiercely Belle had once admired him, how she had watched him dream and build, and how he, in his arrogance, had cast her aside like collateral damage. Now here was a child, her child, repeating truths he had buried under contracts and skyscrapers, and as his throat tightened, he found himself staring too long, too hard, unable to breathe because those eyes, those clear blue eyes, framed by lashes damp with tears, were his own mirror, undeniable and damning, staring back at him from the face of innocence. His chest constricted, a storm of recognition, dread, and awe surging all at once, because it was not just Belle lying broken on the floor, it was the truth unraveling before him, and though sirens wailed faintly in the distance, drawing closer, the world had already tilted, and with a tremor he could not disguise, Alexander realized the child in front of him, trembling but unflinching, was not just a stranger he had stumbled upon in fate's cruel twist. She was his blood, his reflection, the piece of his past he had thought erased, and the revelation crashed over him with such force that for the first time in years, the indomitable Alexander Vance felt utterly powerless, caught between the fragile rise and fall of Belle's chest and the steady, accusing gaze of the daughter he never knew he had. Alexander's world seemed to shatter in that suffocating silence, as the weight of the past pressed down on him heavier than the smell of gas lingering in the air, his chest rising and falling as though every breath carried shards of regret. His mind drifted backward to the days when Belle's laughter had been the only thing that softened the edges of his ruthless ambition, when her touch had steadied him in the chaos of boardrooms and skyscraper blueprints, but he had let her go. No, he had pushed her away, convinced that love was a distraction and empire building demanded sacrifice. Yet now, kneeling beside her unconscious body, her little girl watching with trembling lips and eyes that mirrored his own, he realized the empire had cost more than he could ever tally, and his whisper, "Belle Vance," hung like a confession in the air, trembling, raw, unguarded. Lily's innocent voice broke the fragile stillness. "You know Mommy?" And the question pierced him like a blade, the kind that didn't draw blood but carved into marrow, forcing him to confront the truth he had buried under deals, towers, and ruthless nights. His lips parted, but no words came, his silence louder than 1,000 confessions, and Lily's wide eyes studied him as though she already knew, as though children carried instincts sharper than any adult could imagine, her small hands clutching the worn teddy bear, knuckles white, hope trembling in her voice as she waited for an answer that could rewrite her tiny world. Alexander's heart pounded like war drums, every beat screaming the truth he wasn't ready to face, every memory colliding, the night he left Belle standing alone, the unspoken promises, the thoughtless cruelty of ambition. And now those mistakes stared back at him through the child's face, his own reflection made innocent and fragile. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, flashing red spilling against the broken window glass he had shattered moments earlier, each flash illuminating Belle's still form and Lily's tearful eyes, each flash demanding urgency, demanding choice. Does he confess now, here, to the child who deserved truth more than anyone, or does he wait until Belle awakens to either save him or condemn him? His throat tightened, words strangled by fear and guilt, because saying, "Yes, I knew her, I loved her, I am your father," would unleash storms he wasn't sure he could weather, but silence would build walls that might never be torn down. Lily's trembling whisper cut into him again, "Mister, why won't you say?" And the innocence in her tone nearly broke him, because for the first time in years Alexander, the man who commanded empires, who made cities bend to his will, felt utterly powerless before the gaze of a child. His child, though he hadn't yet dared to claim the word. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, the echo of Belle's laughter haunted him, the echo of his own selfishness suffocated him, and still he knelt, unable to answer, while the sirens outside roared closer, closer, until their lights painted the walls in streaks of judgment, demanding, will he speak, or will silence swallow him whole? Does he tell the child the truth? Alexander didn't flinch as the paramedics stormed the dim apartment, their gloved hands working swiftly, their voices clipped with urgency as they strapped Belle to the stretcher and checked her vitals, and though he knew these men and women were trained to save lives, his chest tightened with a raw panic he couldn't cage, because the sight of Belle's limp body being lifted away was too much like watching the brightest piece of his past slipping through his fingers again. He leaned in closer, refusing to surrender his place at her side, his tailored suit smudged with dust and sweat, but nothing in the world could make him leave her now, not when fate had dragged him back into this moment, not when she lay there fighting for breath. Lily's tiny fingers reached for him, trembling, desperate, and when she whispered, "Don't leave us, please," the sound of her plea pierced him deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever could, for in those words he heard not only a child's fear, but also the echo of promises he had once made to her mother and broken. His throat tightened as he wrapped his hand around Lily's, and for the first time in years he admitted to himself that here, in this crumbling building, with this frightened little girl and this unconscious woman, he felt powerless and yet utterly necessary, a man stripped of wealth and titles and revealed for what he really was. Someone still bound to them in ways he could no longer deny. Outside, chaos brewed, the sharp glow of cameras cutting through the grimy windows, reporters pressing forward like vultures. Their questions already shouted. Why was Alexander King, the ruthless billionaire who never spared a glance for the poor, standing guard in a forgotten neighborhood, shielding a woman and child as though they were his entire world? He wanted to scream at them, to block their lenses, to shield Belle and Lily from the cruel glare of speculation, but all he could do was stand firm as the medics urged him to let go, to step aside so they could carry Belle down the stairwell to the waiting ambulance. Yet even then his hand lingered on the stretcher until the last possible moment, his eyes locked on her pale face, silently begging her to fight her way back. His mind, usually so sharp and calculating, spun wildly with memories, her laughter echoing in sunlit fields, her voice calling his name the night he left, the way he had convinced himself empire was worth more than love. And as the stretcher rolled toward the door, Lily pressed closer to him, hiding her face against his leg, and his heart cracked open at the realization that this child, whose presence he had only just begun to understand, trusted him without hesitation. He bent low, whispering, "I'm not going anywhere," and though the words came out hoarse, they were truer than anything he had spoken in years. The stairwell shook with the crush of journalists, their flashes blinding, their shouts deafening. Why is he here? Who's the woman? Is this his secret family? And Alexander clenched his jaw, knowing every step he took behind that stretcher would feed a firestorm of headlines, yet not caring, because what mattered now was not his reputation, but Belle's survival. And as the ambulance doors swung open with a metallic slam, he guided Lily inside before anyone could stop him, his body shielding her from the frenzy outside, his soul braced for the unknown. The paramedics worked relentlessly, fitting Belle with oxygen, monitoring her heart, while Alexander sat rigid on the bench, one arm around Lily, the other clutching the edge of the gurney as if his grip alone could anchor Belle to this world. And as the sirens wailed to life and the ambulance lurched forward, he closed his eyes against the storm of thoughts crashing inside him, whispering to himself like a vow, "You cannot leave me again." His entire being split between terror and hope, caught in the brutal uncertainty of whether the woman he once loved, and the child who now looked at him like a lifeline, would be granted back to him by fate, or stolen away forever. In the sterile silence of the hospital waiting room, Alexander paced like a caged lion, his tailored suit wrinkled, his hair falling across his forehead in disarray, the sheen of power that usually defined him stripped away by a fear he could not buy his way out of. And as he stared through the glass wall at the frantic motion of doctors surrounding Belle's body on the operating table, something inside him cracked open, something buried for years beneath contracts and conquests, and his throat tightened as he realized every skyscraper, every empire, every deal meant nothing compared to the fragile woman fighting for her life a few feet away. He pressed his trembling hand against the cold glass, as if somehow that contact could reach her, whispering under his breath, words he hadn't spoken in years, her name, her laughter, the promises he had once made but broken, and behind him Lily sat curled in the hard plastic chair, her tiny hands clasped together, her voice trembling in whispered prayer. "Please, God, don't take Mommy. Don't take her. She said you loved us even if you weren't here." And the sound of that prayer ripped him open more brutally than any business betrayal ever had, because in her fragile plea was the echo of all the nights Belle must have comforted this child alone, all the tears shed without him, all the strength it had taken to raise their daughter while he had chased the illusion of greatness. His vision blurred with tears he hadn't allowed himself in decades, his chest heaving as he realized he had failed them both, failed in ways money could never fix, and yet for the first time in years, he wanted nothing but to be needed. Not by shareholders, not by a boardroom, but by this little girl clutching hope like a lifeline, and by the woman lying pale and broken on that table. And as the beeping monitors echoed, he felt utterly powerless, his control slipping through his fingers, and still, he couldn't look away, couldn't leave, couldn't abandon them again, even as reporters gathered outside the hospital doors, their cameras waiting to capture the image of the ruthless billionaire crumbling like a man undone. And in the quiet chaos of the waiting room, he sank to his knees beside Lily, taking her small hands into his much larger ones, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I failed you once, Belle, but I swear, I won't fail you again, not now, not ever." And his heart hammered with a single terrifying question that clawed through him as the operating room doors swung wider, revealing only shadows and silhouettes. Would fate grant him the second chance he had prayed for too late? Or was this the moment life would strip him of it forever? The sterile hum of the hospital machines filled the air as Belle's chest rose faintly under the thin white sheet, her eyelids fluttering like fragile wings before finally opening, and the first thing she saw was the man she once loved standing motionless by the bed, his once proud frame trembling, his piercing blue eyes no longer cold but soaked with tears, and for a heartbeat time froze as shock, pain, and recognition rippled through her face, before Lily, who had been curled up in a corner with her tiny hands clasped in prayer, cried out with uncontainable joy and rushed to her mother's side, burying her tear-streaked cheeks against Belle's frail body, whispering over and over, "Mommy, you're alive, Mommy, please don't leave me again." While Alexander stood a step back, his chest heaving, his hands clenched at his sides as if the weight of every mistake pressed him deeper into the tiled floor, waiting for her to speak, waiting for a judgment that could shatter him more than any business failure ever could. And when Belle's lips parted weakly, her voice rasping through cracked breaths, her question cut through the silence like a blade. Why are you here?" And those words struck harder than any courtroom accusation, harder than the jeers of the world, because they carried the echo of every lonely night she had endured, every tear shed without him, every unanswered cry for help. And in that instant Alexander, the billionaire known for crushing rivals and bending empires to his will, collapsed to his knees as if the marble beneath him could no longer hold his guilt, his voice raw and breaking as he said, "Because this time, I answered the call." His shoulders shaking not with arrogance but with surrender, with the humility of a man stripped bare of titles, money, and power, leaving only a father desperate for forgiveness, and a man terrified of losing the only woman who had ever seen through his armor. And Lily, sensing the gravity of the moment, looked from her mother's pale face to the man trembling at her bedside, and, with the innocence only a child could possess, reached out her tiny hand to Alexander, silently bridging the chasm that years of silence had carved. And when his fingers wrapped around hers he felt, for the first time in decades, not control but belonging, a fragile belonging that did not demand perfection or wealth but simply presence, simply love. And as Belle watched her daughter place her trust in him, her heart wavered between the scars of the past and the faint glow of a future that could be healed, her tears mingling with the beeping monitors as she whispered, "Don't fail her. Don't fail us again." And Alexander, bowing his head against the side of the bed, breathed back with fierce conviction, "Never again, Belle, never again." And in that vow, spoken not in boardrooms or contracts but in the trembling quiet of a hospital room, lay the true empire he had sought all his life, not of wealth or skyscrapers, but of hearts that needed him. And as the night gave way to dawn, the cameras and reporters outside waiting for scandal found nothing but silence, because behind those walls, a man had finally discovered that legacy is not measured in profits or towers that scrape the sky, but in the hands you hold when the world strips everything else away. And as Alexander sat at Belle's bedside with Lily's small fingers wrapped around his, he realized he could lose every dollar, every deal, every title, and yet still leave behind something greater: love, kindness, and the fragile but unbreakable bond of family. And with that truth settling into his soul, the story faded, not with victory chants or empire tallies, but with the quiet image of a broken billionaire reborn as a father and a man who finally understood that humanity endures when wealth crumbles, and that love, above all, is the only legacy worth leaving.